Dark forests. Flickering torches. A woman screams as she's dragged from her home. But this isn't a fairy tale, it really happened. For over 300 years, tens of thousands across Europe and America were accused of witchcraft. Most were innocent. Most were women. And most never saw it coming. But where did this terror begin? Who lit the first match, and why did it take centuries to stop? This is not just a story of superstition. It's a story of fear, power, and silence. The true witch hunts were far stranger, and far darker, than you've ever imagined. Subscribe, and step into the full story. Whispers curl through the air just before dawn. In a small village square, somewhere in 16th century Bavaria, fog hugs the cobbled ground like a living thing. The townspeople, bleary-eyed and tense, gather with torches lit and murmurs low. A woman is dragged from her cottage, barefoot, her nightdress streaked with mud. No one speaks her name aloud. By dusk, she'll be burned as a witch. And not one among them will question why, at least, not yet. How did entire communities come to believe their friends and neighbors were in league with the devil? What makes a society turn on itself with such righteous violence? The true story of the witch hunts isn't just about superstition or fear, it's about power, pain, and the stories we tell to survive both. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. The myth of the witch hunt is well known: dark forests, bubbling cauldrons, the crackle of fire beneath a wooden stake. But behind that imagery lies something far more complex, and far more human. It didn't begin with fire, it began with suspicion. By the early 1400s, rumors of witchcraft had already begun spreading through whispers and sermons. Local folklore warned of women who flew on brooms, caused storms, or cursed livestock. These stories weren't always feared, sometimes, they were even celebrated. Folk healers, often women, held positions of respect in rural communities. Their potions and charms were seen as helpful, even holy. But something shifted. As Europe lurched through the chaos of plague, war, and famine, uncertainty grew like mold in damp walls. The Church, long the arbiter of spiritual truth, began casting a harsher gaze on folk traditions. Healing herbs became suspicious. Midwives were accused of preventing births, not aiding them. Anxieties that once lived in stories were now being dragged into courtrooms. In 1428, in the Valais region of modern-day Switzerland, one of the earliest large-scale witch hunts erupted. It wasn't led by inquisitors or kings, but by local officials, acting on whispers and oaths. Over 300 people were executed in just a few years. Some historians point to this as the true start of the European witch craze. Others argue that the fires had smoldered long before, quiet, localized, and often undocumented. A strange detail from those early years: in some alpine villages, people believed witches gathered not at night, but at noon, flying on wooden planks rather than brooms. It's one of many small, regional differences that challenge the idea of a single witch archetype. In truth, what one town saw as a healer, another saw as a heretic. And scholars still debate whether these beliefs emerged from grassroots folk panic or were shaped from above by church politics and legal agendas. Was the witch hunt a top-down mechanism of control, or did it rise from the very communities it destroyed? Either way, the pattern was set. Fear would spread, authorities would act, and the line between superstition and law would blur. But it wasn't until a particular book was published, one that promised to identify, try, and destroy witches, that the scale of the hysteria would explode. In the centuries before the first stake was lit, Europe was already teeming with spirits, spells, and spectral fears. Long before witch became a death sentence, the idea of people wielding hidden powers was deeply woven into local life. Forests weren't just forests, they were alive with old gods, vengeful fairies, and cunning folk who claimed to know the language of herbs and stars. The Christian Church, rising steadily through late antiquity and into the medieval world, had a complicated relationship with these beliefs. On one hand, it condemned paganism. On the other, it absorbed and rebranded parts of it. Saints replaced household deities. Holy wells sprang up where sacred springs once flowed. And yet, certain figures refused to disappear, especially the woman who lived on the edge of the village, who knew the plants that could end pain or, perhaps, end pregnancy. What we now call witchcraft wasn't a single tradition. It was a vast patchwork of folk medicine, midwifery, local legend, and cultural memory. In Norse mythology, seeresses called Volar performed rituals in elaborate cloaks, speaking prophecy. In Slavic lands, tales of the Baba Yaga, a crone in a walking hut with iron teeth, warned of the dangers and wisdom hidden in the woods. These archetypes were neither wholly good nor wholly evil. They were feared and respected, not hunted. But over time, a shadow grew behind them. As the church expanded its influence, it sought to eliminate ambiguities. The ambiguity of a woman who could both cure and curse made her dangerous. By the 10th century, the church was officially denouncing belief in witches, not because it feared them, but because it saw them as superstitious nonsense. Ironically, early church doctrine held that people couldn't fly or summon demons, only God held that kind of power. Witchcraft was heresy, yes, but more for believing in false power than for wielding it. Still, local belief endured. And when hardship struck, when a cow died, or a storm ruined a harvest, it was often easier to blame the old woman on the hill than to accept randomness or misfortune. By the 13th century, the Inquisition had begun its campaign against heresy. Though it focused more on religious dissenters than witches, the machinery for widespread persecution was now in place. A curious example from the 12th century tells of a woman in what's now northern France who was said to bake bread that caused hallucinations. Villagers accused her of using devil flour. Modern scholars suspect it may have been ergot, a mold that grows on rye and causes visions, possibly even the same culprit behind some witchcraft accusations centuries later. Whether it was poison, punishment, or misunderstanding, we'll likely never know. But the tale captures the era's mood, magical thinking mixed with fear of the unfamiliar. And scholars still debate whether the medieval church's tolerance toward folk practices was genuine or merely strategic. Was it buying time, allowing the old ways to fade naturally? Or was it building a case to strike later? By the late 1400s, that strike came, not from a pulpit or a throne, but from a printing press. A single book would gather centuries of scattered fears, dress them in Latin authority, and give them a chillingly precise how-to guide. In 1487, a Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer published a book with a title as heavy as its consequences, Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. It wasn't the first work on witchcraft, but it was by far the most influential. And it didn't just describe witches, it armed the world against them. Bound in Gothic Latin and cloaked in religious justification, the Malleus was half legal manual, half fever dream. It declared that witches were real, that they were overwhelmingly women, and that they posed a grave threat to Christian society. It also laid out, in disturbing detail, how to identify, interrogate, and punish them. It promised clarity in an uncertain world, and people listened. The invention of the printing press just a few decades earlier meant the Malleus could be replicated widely, and quickly. Within years, it had become one of the most popular books in Europe, second only to the Bible in some regions. That popularity gave it power. What had once been local superstitions or inconsistent trials now became codified. The witch had a profile, a behavior, a script, and so did the inquisitor. Kramer, ironically, had faced backlash before publishing. His earlier attempts to prosecute witches were dismissed by church authorities as overzealous. In 1485, a bishop in Innsbruck declared him mentally unstable and ordered him out of town. The malleus, then, may have been both a response to that humiliation and a bid to reclaim credibility. And it worked. The book's relentless logic, cloaked in theology, spread like kindling in a dry forest. One of its most sinister elements was its view of women. According to the malleus, women were naturally more susceptible to the devil's influence due to their supposed weakness, lust, and deceitfulness. It argued that even Eve had set the precedent, falling first, corrupting man. In Kramer's eyes, this ancient failure had never ended. Now it wore the face of the village healer, the unmarried midwife, or the outspoken widow. In practice, the malleus turned vague accusations into structured persecutions. Did a neighbor fall ill after a disagreement? Did someone mutter to themselves near your livestock? The book had a checklist. It also instructed judges to accept confessions obtained under torture and to treat retractions as proof of Satan's influence. In other words, there was no way to prove innocence, only guilt not yet discovered. A fringe anecdote from that era tells of a German town that accused a cat of being a witch's familiar. The cat was arrested, tried, and drowned. Whether satire or sincerity, it underscores how absurd, and terrifying, logic had become. And scholars still debate whether the malleus was truly as influential as it seemed, or if it simply reflected ideas that were already gaining momentum. Did it ignite the fire, or just throw oil on it? What's certain is that after 1487, accusations of witchcraft became more frequent, more systematic, and more deadly. Trials increased. Executions rose. The paranoia deepened. And women, especially those on society's fringes, found themselves walking a narrow line between harmless and heretical. The flames had been lit. But soon, they'd leap beyond isolated towns and courtrooms. Entire nations would start to burn. The woman accused of witchcraft is often portrayed as an outsider, a crone in rags, muttering spells beside a fire. But behind that image lies a more troubling truth, one that cuts to the heart of gender, power, and fear. Historians estimate that roughly 75 to 85% of those accused and executed for witchcraft in Europe were women. And while some were indeed elderly or isolated, many were anything but. Some were young mothers. Others were widows or midwives. A few were even wealthy. The one common thread? They existed just outside the boundaries of what their society considered safe for a woman to be. In early modern Europe, a woman's role was tightly scripted: obedient daughter, chaste bride, devoted mother. Step outside that narrative, by choosing not to marry, by owning property, by practicing herbal medicine, and you invited suspicion. A woman with knowledge was dangerous. A woman with independence was, perhaps, in league with the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum had already laid the theological groundwork, claiming that women were inherently more impressionable and morally weak. But the deeper reason for the gendered panic was societal change. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, Europe was transforming. Feudalism was crumbling. The Reformation fractured religious unity. Plagues had upended demographics. In this unstable world, gender roles hardened. Patriarchal control intensified, not because women were more powerful, but because men felt their power slipping. Witch hunts offered a perverse kind of order. They policed behavior, especially female behavior, through terror. A woman who spoke too freely, wore the wrong colors, or healed someone without a license could be accused. And accusations had a way of multiplying. Once one woman was charged, others followed. Entire networks, sisters, friends, midwives, could be swept away in a single trial. But not all victims were women. In Iceland, for instance, over 90% of the accused were men. Why? Because Icelandic folk magic, known as galdr, was traditionally practiced by men. There, the archetype of the witch was different. It's a crucial reminder that while the witch hunts were deeply gendered, they also adapted to local customs and fears. One of the stranger details from court records comes from Würzburg, Germany, where in 1629, a 9-year-old boy named Hannes was accused of witchcraft after claiming to ride a goat through the night sky. He was tortured until he confessed and ultimately executed. His story, tragic and surreal, underscores how far the panic reached, and how age offered no protection. And scholars still debate whether misogyny was the cause of the witch hunts or merely a tool they used. Did society truly fear powerful women, or were accusations simply a way to settle scores and redistribute property? What's clear is that gender shaped not only who was accused but how they were punished. Men might be hanged. Women were more often burned, purified by fire, their supposed lust and evil sent to the heavens as smoke. As the 16th century wore on, the image of the witch became more vivid, more uniform, and more deadly. But this was no isolated phenomenon. Across Europe, the same script played out in dozens of languages, across hundreds of borders. What began as scattered local trials was about to become a continental epidemic. Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was a continent on edge. Wars raged, borders shifted, and famine stalked entire regions. Amid this instability, witch hunts didn't just persist, they exploded. And nowhere did they burn more fiercely than in the German-speaking lands. Between 1560 and 1630, parts of what is now Germany, France, and Switzerland witnessed some of the most intense and deadly witch trials in recorded history. Small towns like Trier, Fulda, and Bamberg turned into centers of mass execution. In some places, hundreds of people were accused in a single wave. Entire families vanished. At the height of the frenzy, no one was too prominent, or too young, to be suspect. Why here? And why then? A major factor was political fragmentation. The Holy Roman Empire, which sprawled across Central Europe, was less an empire than a patchwork of principalities and church territories. Each ruler could set their own laws, and each wanted to prove their commitment to stamping out heresy and chaos. Witch hunts became a political performance, a demonstration of moral purity and control. Trier, for example, executed over 300 people between 1581 and 1593. Among them were judges, nobles, and even children. The driving force? Prince Bishop Johann von Schonenberg, who believed eradicating witches would restore divine favor. It didn't. But the deaths continued anyway. France, too, saw its share of trials, especially in border regions like Lorraine. Meanwhile, Scotland, fueled by a combination of Calvinist zeal and royal paranoia, embarked on its own wave of witch persecution. King James VI, later James I of England, was particularly obsessed. After a storm disrupted his voyage in 1590, he blamed witchcraft and personally involved himself in trials. His 1597 book, Demonology, stoked fears further and helped justify the torture and execution of alleged witches. And yet, each region had its own quirks. In Scotland, witches were often accused of consorting with fairies, an echo of older Celtic beliefs. In Denmark, the devil was said to appear not as a man with horns, but as a talking animal. These local details didn't slow the trials. If anything, they gave them momentum. One of the strangest cases occurred in the Basque Country, along the Spanish-French border. In 1609, the Spanish Inquisition, often thought of as a major driver of witch hunts, was surprisingly skeptical. Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias investigated mass accusations in the village of Zugarramurdi. After extensive interviews and a lack of concrete evidence, he famously concluded, there were neither witches nor bewitched. His restraint was rare. His peers, elsewhere, were not so cautious. And scholars still debate whether these massive witch trials reflected genuine panic among the populace, or were orchestrated by elites to distract from economic and political failures. Was the witch a scapegoat for suffering, or a tool of control? What's undeniable is the scale. In Germany alone, over 25,000 people may have been executed between 1450 and 1750. Entire regions were depopulated. Neighbors turned against each other. Children informed on parents. The structure of trust, so essential to village life, crumbled under the weight of accusation. By now, the fire had spread too far for reason to contain it. And the courtroom, meant to serve as a place of justice, had become a stage for confessions no one could ever truly give freely. Inside the dim halls of early modern courtrooms, truth bent under the pressure of fear. The witch trials were not merely legal proceedings, they were theatrical rituals of control. And the stagecraft was brutal. Accusations often began with rumor. A child fell ill. A field failed to yield. A cow gave sour milk. Whispers followed, and a name emerged. That was enough to trigger an inquiry. From there, things moved quickly. The accused would be arrested, typically without warning or defense. Evidence, as we might recognize it today, was optional. Instead, the courts leaned on confession, and they had ways of getting one. Torture was not just allowed, it was expected. In many jurisdictions, it was even regulated. Torture could only be applied a certain number of times, or for so long. But these limits were often ignored. The accused were stretched on racks, pricked with needles, or suspended by their arms until joints tore. One common method involved pressing, a board placed on the body with heavy stones added incrementally. Few could endure such pain without confessing, even to impossible things. A confession, of course, didn't mean safety. It meant execution. But a confession also served the court's need for narrative. Trials required a coherent story. The accused had met the devil, signed his book, perhaps flown through the night sky to a Sabbath. These details were shaped not by what actually happened, but by what inquisitors expected to hear. Spectral evidence, testimony that someone's ghost or spirit had committed a crime, was admissible in some regions. A person could be convicted because a neighbor dreamed of them turning into a raven. One famous example comes from England's Pendle witch trials of 1612, where a 9-year-old girl named Janet Device testified against her own family. Her words, encouraged by officials, helped send her mother, brother, and sister to the gallows. A stranger tidbit comes from a trial in Estonia, where a woman claimed she flew to the witch's Sabbath on the back of a man who had transformed into a black horse. When asked how she stayed on, she replied, "I held fast to his mane." The court, remarkably, took this as further evidence of truth. After all, she had provided specific details. And scholars still debate whether most accused witches actually believed their own confessions. Were they broken by torture? Did they internalize the accusations? Or were some simply telling the stories they knew were expected, hoping to end the suffering sooner? Once convicted, sentencing followed quickly. In many Protestant regions, witches were hanged. In Catholic lands, they were burned. Not always alive, sometimes strangled first, but not always mercifully, either. Executions were public, intended as warnings. People brought children. Vendors sold food. The spectacle reinforced communal morality. This is what happens when someone steps outside the line. But even those who survived the ordeal were marked. A woman acquitted of witchcraft might return home to find her property seized, her reputation ruined, and her family gone. In many cases, exile was a quieter kind of execution. By the early 17th century, these courtroom rituals had been repeated thousands of times across Europe. And yet, the formula rarely changed. Accusation. Torture. Confession. Death. It was a system designed not to discover truth, but to reaffirm fear. And as Europe's empires expanded, that fear would cross oceans. A new land promised new beginnings, but it brought the same old demons with it. The forests of New England were vast, unfamiliar, and thick with shadow. For the Puritans who crossed the Atlantic in the early 1600s, the New World was both a promised land and a deeply haunted one. Every rustle in the trees could be an Indian ambush. Every misfortune might be God's punishment. And somewhere in that anxious atmosphere, the European witch hunt found fertile ground to grow anew. The most infamous of all American witch trials took place in 1692, in the small Puritan settlement of Salem, Massachusetts. Over the course of a year, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to plead. It remains one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history. The Salem Panic began, as so many others did, with a few young girls. They claimed to be afflicted by unseen forces, scratching, choking, convulsing without cause. Under questioning, they pointed fingers at local women. Tituba, an enslaved Caribbean woman in the household of Reverend Parris, was among the first accused. Her testimony, part confession, part performance, involved black dogs, flying spirits, and the devil's book. Whether coerced or strategic, it inflamed the imagination of an already fearful community. But Salem wasn't unique. Witch trials had already occurred in other colonies, Connecticut, Virginia, even New York. What made Salem different was the speed and scale of the hysteria, and the social web it tore apart. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Old feuds surfaced as fresh accusations. Land disputes, inheritance battles, and church politics all found their way into the courtroom under the guise of spiritual warfare. In a strange twist, the Puritans' obsession with the devil may have been intensified by the wildness of the land itself. The vast, untamed forests seemed to echo medieval fears of witches gathering in hidden places. Indigenous spiritual practices, misunderstood or demonized, were seen as more evidence that dark forces roamed the frontier. Some settlers even claimed that Native Americans practiced sorcery in league with Satan. A curious case from colonial Connecticut in 1651 involved a woman named Mary Parsons. She was accused after being seen gathering mushrooms in the woods. For the devout, even this simple act could signal alliance with evil. Mushrooms, after all, were associated with poison, decay, and mystery. And scholars still debate whether the Salem trials reflected deeper societal trauma, the aftermath of smallpox outbreaks, the displacement caused by frontier wars, or the rigid hierarchies of Puritan theology. Was the panic spontaneous, or an eruption of long-simmering pressure? By the end of 1692, the tide began to turn. Governor William Phips, whose own wife was accused, halted the trials. Public opinion soured. Several jurors and judges issued apologies. One of the main accusers later confessed that they had lied. But the damage was done. Families were destroyed. Reputations shattered. Salem marked the last major witch trial in the American colonies. But the fear it embodied, the belief that evil hides in plain sight, that society must root it out, would linger in other forms. From McCarthyism to moral panics, the ghosts of those old Puritan fears have never fully left. Across the Atlantic, too, the fire was beginning to fade. But not because fear had vanished. Instead, a new set of ideas, stranger, colder, and quietly revolutionary, was beginning to take root. By the dawn of the 18th century, the bonfires began to sputter. The frenzy that had consumed tens of thousands of lives over 3 centuries was waning. Witch hunts did not end with a dramatic reversal or a single grand decree. They faded out, slowly, unevenly, and not without resistance. Several forces converged to snuff out the flames. Chief among them was the rise of the Enlightenment. In salons and lecture halls from London to Paris, a new generation of thinkers began to question everything: the nature of God, the structure of society, and most crucially, the sources of knowledge itself. Reason, evidence, and skepticism were held up as ideals. And when courts and kings applied those principles to witchcraft, the results were often damning, not of the accused, but of the accusers. The last known execution for witchcraft in Western Europe took place in Switzerland, in 1782. Anna Goldie, a maid, was accused of placing pins in her employer's daughter via magical means. Though officially executed for poisoning, her trial bore all the classic features of a witch hunt. It would later be denounced as a miscarriage of justice. By then, such trials were already rare. But the fact that they still happened, even as America was declaring independence and Europe was embracing science, reminds us that fear lingers long after its justifications have crumbled. Oddly enough, climate may have played a role in ending the hunts. The so-called Little Ice Age, which chilled Europe from roughly the 14th to 19th centuries, brought colder winters, failed crops, and social unrest. This hardship fueled witchcraft accusations, especially against women blamed for storms or blights. As the climate stabilized toward the 18th century, the desperation that had fanned the flames also began to ease. But the legal reforms mattered, too. In 1682, Louis XIV of France declared witchcraft a fraud and ended executions. In Prussia, Frederick William I instructed judges to ignore accusations unless the devil is caught in the act. These weren't shifts in morality, necessarily, but in optics and governance. Rulers wanted to project reason, stability, and modernity. Burning women alive for invisible crimes did not fit the image. Still, scholars debate whether the Enlightenment truly saved Europe from superstition, or whether it simply replaced old fears with new ones. Did we trade witches for political heretics, or for enemies of the state? And what of the lingering folklore, the spells, the superstitions, that never went away? One quirky remnant can be found in the town of Vardo, in northern Norway. It was the site of one of the worst Scandinavian witch trials in the 1600s. Today, it hosts a striking memorial, a hollow cube of lights that glows at night, one for each person killed. In the cold polar silence, it hums with quiet reckoning. There are no slogans. Just names. And light. As the witch hunts ended, they left behind not just ash, but questions. Why did so many participate? Why did so few resist? And why were so many willing to believe that evil wore the face of their neighbor? The silence that followed the hunts was, in many ways, as haunting as the hysteria itself. There were no widespread reparations. No grand public apologies. Just absence. Empty villages. Gaps in parish records. And scars passed down in whispers. But the memory endures. In museums, in books, in monuments, and in the stories we still tell about fear, about otherness, and about what it takes for a society to turn on itself. Conclusion. The true story of the witch hunts is not one of magic, it's one of fear, power, and the human need for certainty in chaos. These were not the acts of monsters, but of communities. Ordinary people, wrapped in extraordinary anxiety, did terrible things in the name of righteousness. We often imagine we've moved far from that world. But the ghosts of the past don't fade so easily. They echo in our modern panics, our conspiracy theories, and our instinct to isolate what we fear. History doesn't always repeat, but it does remind. To remember the witch hunts is to confront a deep part of our shared psychology, the part that chooses accusation over understanding, and fire over doubt. If you found this journey illuminating, consider subscribing for more stories from the forgotten corners of history.